Everybody needs to understand that I'm more than simply a hype man for this rap group, just like Geico is more than just a company that can save you money. Geico also has fast and friendly claim service, so they can help you when you need it most. And while I do love being a hype man, I also love reading for children's audiobooks. Like Little Bo Peep, she lost the sheep, and she don't know where to find them. Go!
Geico. Expect great savings and a whole lot more.
Blog Talk Radio. Welcome to
Within the Chaos
with your host,
Rodney Shortridge,
and co-host,
Robin Dalton.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us again tonight. You can listen in by going to blogtalkradio.com/Within the Chaos, or to listen in by phone, dial 323-870-4197. You can also call in to ask any questions to our guests at the same number, 323-870-1497. From deep within the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you for listening to Within the Chaos. My name is Rodney Shortridge, and I'll be your host tonight, along with my fiery redhead co-host, Robin Dalton.
Hey, y'all.
I was beginning to wonder if she was there. Tonight, our special guest is Randy Williams. Excuse me. Randy is the owner of the Black Stallion Security and Investigations and is the founder of the Close Range Combat Academy and has authored 9 books on the Chinese martial art of Wing Chun Kung Fu. And Sherlock Holmes and the Autumn of Terror is his second venture into fictional writing. So, Robin, How was your week?
Well, other than this horrible cold I have gotten from clients at work, not too bad.
It
It's,
sounds nasty.
Yeah, we've had some clients at work sick, and of course I picked it up, so I'm trying to recover from that. So bear with me tonight if you hear me hacking and barking like a dog.
Oh, get you some Mucinex or something.
Well, I went to the doctor the other day, and I came out with half a pharmacy. So I'm well on my way to being better.
How the hell was you able to do that? Especially up there in West Virginia without somebody trying to take your damn drugs.
I was well protected.
Okay. Well, I guess I won't keep everybody in suspense any longer. It's my honor to welcome our special guest, Randy Williams. Hello, Randy, and thank you for joining us tonight, bud. How you doing?
I'm great. Glad to be here.
There you go. He earlier, Robin, he sent me a message, and he's like, pretty much, "Are you there? Are we going to have a show, dude? Where are you?" And I'm like, "I'm here." I was just busy, but actually, I just got up and sitting here in my tidy whities and thought I'd join in and have a show.
Glad you could make it.
Well, Randy, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, bud?
Well, it's not really all that interesting. I'm a private investigator. I live in Pennsylvania, up in the mountains in northeastern Pennsylvania. I'm involved in the martial arts. I've been doing that for many, many years. And over the last, for the better part of 40-plus years, I've been looking into the Jack the Ripper case. And in the last 5 years, I've worked really hard on solving it and have actually come up with a new solution that a lot of people are looking at and believing, in particular, some of the world's top criminologists. So I live up here, on a farm with my 6 horses and my donkey and my 3 dogs, and I occasionally travel and do the martial arts seminars and go to London whenever I can to look into the Ripper crimes.
That's awesome. Well, that's what I want to focus. That's what I want to focus on tonight is about your book and about Jack the Ripper. So, can you explain why they called him Jack the Ripper?
Sure. Well, first of all, the name was coined in a letter that, it's still to this day debated whether or not he actually wrote. But in this letter, he calls himself Jack the Ripper. But I do have my own theory on why he was called Jack the Ripper, or why he called himself Jack the Ripper, and that is because of the fact that one of the knives used, I believe, was a jackknife, a 6-inch jackknife. And back in the day, in the 1880s in London, there were groups of guys that would prey on prostitutes, who they used to call unfortunates back then. And these guys that would prey on the prostitutes were called high rip gangs. So I believe that the name Jack the Ripper is kind of a blend of the jackknife and the high rip concept, because I think they looked at themselves as a little high rip gang.
So where did the Ripper operate from in London? Was it a certain area?
Well, yes, the East End of London, which was known as and still is known as Whitechapel, was an area in London where the most poverty, you could say, homelessness, disease, and of course prostitution was rampant. And the Ripper did his killings all in a very small area, which I'm going to be able to show you is in a very tight circle around where he lived.
Wow. I'm sorry, y'all. It's cold is getting me. So, exactly, do you know how many people were killed by Jack the Ripper?
Well, that's to be debated too. Now, according to my theory and some things I'll be able to explain to you as we go on, I believe that he killed at least 13 women, possibly 14. And I've made that calculation not only based on the MO that he used, but based on the strategic dates that the women were killed on. Contrary to popular belief, there was an actual pattern to the nights when the Ripper struck. They were all nights that are very important in the Eastern liturgical Christian church, nights that are celebrating the Mother Mary. And every single one of the Ripper killings took place on one of those nights, which are known as Theotokos. That's the Greek name for Mother Mary. And I've been able to prove that every one of these 14 murders that took place around that period were all on Theotokos nights. There are only 12 Theotokos nights in a year, and 14 murders took place all on Theotokos nights, which means, according to a mathematician friend of mine, the odds against that being coincidental are expressed by a figure of 7 followed by 15 zeros to 1. So we have basically the equivalent of a DNA match to the fact that these nights weren't randomly chosen.
Wow.
So, what time period did the Ripper murders take place?
Started in 1888 and went on until 1891, according to my belief. But the popular belief of most of what they call Ripperologists, they call the people that are concerned with the case and like to look into it and investigate it, sort of amateur sleuths, are known as Ripperologists. It's kind of a slang, a funny way of referring to people that are interested in the case. Now, according to most Ripperologists, there are only 5 that everyone agrees on, and they're known as the canonical, meaning accepted by everyone. So there are only 5 murders which everyone agrees were Jack the Ripper. And then there can't say everyone because you can't get everybody to agree on anything. But there are 5 that are generally believed by most to have been done by Jack the Ripper. But I've uncovered evidence that leads me to believe there were at least 13 and possibly 14. And those murders took place from 1888 until 1891.
So, who were the victims of the Ripper?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Who were the victims of the Ripper? Were they only the women, or were they only prostitutes, or?
Yeah, all of the women that were killed by the Ripper or attacked by the Ripper were prostitutes, although a couple of them gave their profession as seamstress, which was kind of a code word used for prostitute. But they were all prostitutes. And back in those days, like I say, they used to refer to the women as unfortunates. But that was, again, a code word in Victorian London, which was very prudish, you could say, in some ways, and in other ways really wild. But in those days, they didn't use the term prostitute so freely. They called the women unfortunates.
Damn. And that's no bullshit. It was unfortunate. So
they were very, very unfortunate.
Yeah. So who was the Ripper's first acknowledged victim?
The first one that everyone, well, again, I can't say everyone because not everyone agrees on anything, but generally accepted was Polly Nichols. Marianne Nichols was considered his first canonical victim. Now, I don't actually believe she was the first, and very many Ripperologists believe that a woman named Martha Tabram was his first victim. That's one that is not considered among the canonical 5, but very many Ripperologists believe that Martha Tabram was one of the victims, and I have been able to prove to the satisfaction of many, including 3 of the world's top criminologists, that she was, in fact, one of the victims for reasons I can explain to you guys now or later.
Okay. But whichever, if you want to go ahead, that's fine.
Well, Martha Tabram, the reason I believe that Martha Tabram was a victim was because my lead suspect was actually a seller of costume jewelry. And he is a guy who claims to have found a body. And we know now that many, many serial killers have claimed to find a body in order to insert themselves into the investigation. Many have done it since, but he may have been the first to have ever done it. Now, Martha Tabram was killed in a place called George Yard in front of the stable. And she was killed with 2 knives, a 6-inch knife and a 9-inch knife. Now, she was killed in George Yard stables. Fast forward to when my lead suspect pretended to find a body. He tells the police in his statement, I'm a seller of costume jewelry, and I keep my horse and buggy stabled in George Yard stables. Now, he qualified that by saying it was a different George Yard stable than the woman was killed in, but that's really irrelevant for reasons I can explain later. But in any case, this guy claims to be coming home from work and parking his horse and buggy in the very stable where she was killed at the very hour when she was killed. Now, the police spoke to her husband, and he told the police that the night before her murder, he had given her his paycheck in order to buy some costume jewelry to resell in order to avoid being a prostitute. So we have this woman, Martha Tabram, shopping for costume jewelry and being killed in the same stable, I believe, that my lead suspect kept his horse and buggy in. And we also know that Martha Tabram wasn't the only Ripper victim that resold costume jewelry. So did another victim called Annie Chapman, who was one of the 5 canonicals. She was known to resell costume jewelry as well. I believe that my lead suspect, in some cases, maybe not all cases, but in some cases, knew these women because he was their supplier of costume jewelry.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So.
Oh yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say everything that I'm going to tell you guys tonight makes sense, or I wouldn't have included it. I'm the worst critic of my own investigation you could have, and I've double and triple and quadruple checked my facts, and there's just no disputing that Martha Tabram was shopping for costume jewelry on the night of her death and was killed in George Yard stable, and that my lead suspect was a costume jewelry salesman who kept his horse and buggy stabled in a George Yard stable.
So, so it's your opinion that all his victims were targeted because of the jewelry, or was it because they were just prostitutes? I mean, is it anything else? Because I know a lot of people and a lot of things I've read about it, it's just been prostitutes. That was the only reason.
Well, I don't think they were targeted because they were looking for costume jewelry, but I think they were chosen because they were convenient for that fact. That was his connection to some of them. And they were definitely chosen because they were prostitutes. That was the main reason they were targeted. But it wasn't entirely because he was a sex-crazed killer. It was, and in fact, he wasn't just one person. He was 3. In any case, the reason they were chosen was because they were prostitutes, but not for the reason that might seem apparent right away. From what I've been able to uncover, they were chosen in order to sort of draw attention, the world's attention, to the fact that there were prostitutes and that there was poverty and disease and homelessness in Whitechapel. I think that what the killers were trying to do was take the world's attention from the British Empire being palaces and fountains and polo games and tea and crumpet and the Queen, and I think they were trying to show the world the unseemly underbelly of England, the capital, London, and they wanted people to see that London wasn't all as grand as it was cracked up to be.
Mm-hmm.
Huh.
So how did he kill or they kill all these victims? Was it the same method, or were they each murder?
Yeah. The MO varied a couple of different ways in different murders, which is very common in serial killings. But in general, the women were killed. They had their throats cut, and in a very telling way, because the way that they were killed, most of them had one shallow cut on one side of their neck and then a really long, deep cut, which is exactly the method used by kosher butchers in what they call shechita, or ritual kosher killings of animals, in a way that would allow the blood pressure to be released with the first cut, and then the second cut could be done without as much spewing of blood. It's a way that kosher butchers to this very day slaughter animals and collect the blood so that it's not spraying arterial blood all over the place when they kill the animal. I believe that the women were killed in a very similar way, with one person behind holding the victim in possibly or probably a half Nelson, with the other hand over her mouth pulling her head back so the other person could make the cut and possibly catch the blood in some sort of a cup or vessel.
So there wasn't a lot of blood found when they found these victims?
No, in some cases there was a distinct shortage of blood, and nobody knows what happened to the blood. That's one of the things that Dr. Wecht, one of my co-authors, noted, and one of the things that led me to this kosher killing theory, because one of the victims killed in a place called Buck's Row was wearing a white garment, and it had no blood on the breast area, although her throat was cut. So how do you cut someone's throat without any blood getting on the front? Now, you could say, well, maybe hang her upside down or have her face down, hanging sort of downhill, but then the blood would go all over the face. The evidence shows a distinct lack or shortage of blood, not complete lack of blood, but shortage from what there should be. And oddly, one of the doctors that examined her said, well, there was about enough blood to fill a wine glass. There should have been more. And he used the term wine glass. And I thought it was unusual because I believe they used something like a wine glass to catch the blood, at least in her case. I don't think they did it in every case, but I think they did it in some cases. Now, the Ripper in one of his letters makes reference to the fact that he had collected the blood from one of his victims and used it to try to write a letter, but it had coagulated, so he couldn't use it, and he ended up having to use red ink instead. But he alludes to the fact that he did catch the blood of a victim.
So, is it known who was the last victim of the Ripper?
Well, again, that's going to depend on what you believe. That's going to depend on whether or not you believe it was just the 5 canonicals, or whether you believe it was more than that. Now, as I was telling you before, what I believe is that he killed as many as 14 women. So, there are many people who don't believe that, or who do believe that Mary Jane Kelly was the last one to have been killed. You've probably seen those horrific pictures of Mary Jane Kelly in her room, all torn to shreds. She was the worst of all the mutilations. But what I believe was that Frances Coles was the last murder. I believe that she was the last, the final kind of last hurrah of the Ripper before he was finally pulled out of England and sent back to his home country by the person who I believe brought him in to do it in the first place. So I know a lot of people will hear my theory and right off the bat, they'll write me off as a crackpot. And I understand that because there have been so many people that have come up with so many wild theories about the Ripper. that it's easy to just discount anyone's opinion when it doesn't match what you think it is. But that's why I would implore your readers to actually look into the evidence that I've uncovered before they just write me off, because I found evidence that no one's seen for 120 odd years, because no one ever suspected the person who I know to have been the lead of the three Rippers. So because they haven't ever looked at this guy very hard, some of my theory may sound crazy, but you have to understand there's a reason why he hasn't been caught for all these 129 years. It's because of the fact that he was very clever and he covered his tracks very well, and he managed to elude the police using these tactics that I finally uncovered with the help of three of the world's top criminologists.
Right. Well, what was the law and order like in London in the late 19th century?
Well, they did have a very good policing system. They had, in fact, a couple of different agencies who covered the area of London called Whitechapel. And in fact, it was kind of where the border of where the Metropolitan Police, the Scotland Yard, the London City Police had their jurisdictions. And in fact, that was part of some of the problem in the case, in that you had competing agencies dealing with the evidence, and they didn't always fully cooperate with one another. And so if the Ripper killed a woman on one side, and then killed another one across the border of jurisdiction, the two agencies didn't necessarily share all of their information with each other. So it caused some friction within the various departments that policed London. But to answer your question, they had a very efficient police system. It's just that the way that the Ripper killed, what he did and how he did it was just unknown. They didn't have the kind of sort of facts to work their case on that we have today. They didn't have case histories to look back at and say, this is probably what he's doing, and this is probably the kind of person that's doing it. All those things came much later.
Right. So there wasn't just like one detective in the Ripper case. There were several then?
Oh, no, there were several. Now, there were a few that were more prominent and had more authority in the case. You had Chief Inspector Frederick Aberline, who I guess he was made famous by the Johnny Depp movie From Hell, where Johnny Depp played Aberline. It didn't follow the facts at all, or not very closely, but Aberline was one of the chief investigators. You had Edmund Reed, who was also a very prominent investigator in the case, and he's been made sort of famous by the TV show, the BBC show called Ripper Street. If you've ever seen that, it's a program about the same force that was investigating the Ripper killings in the years that followed the Ripper case, with some of the other crime that took place in London and how they handled it. But the Inspector Reed, is the lead character in that show. So a lot of people know his name now because of that. So I'd say those were the two main investigators, but there were many.
Wow. So do the police know or have an idea who the Ripper is?
Oh, yes. I know exactly who he was. And as I told you, he wasn't just one person. He was actually three people. It was a team of three men.
Right.
And I believe that they were funded, they were commissioned, organized, and funded by a fourth man who I believe didn't take part in the actual killings, but he was just sort of the mastermind, not unlike these ISIS terrorist acts that take place today that are inspired by, a leader that may be in London or maybe, in hiding somewhere, who motivates the people, maybe funds them, rewards them for what they do, but isn't actually involved in the hands-on of the killing.
Oh.
So, who was the best known suspects that they came up with at that time, and what's your opinion, or who do you think it was? I mean, let's just put it out there. But who's Jack the Ripper?
Well, I'm going to tell you, Jack the Ripper was three men, and actually I refer to this other guy as the fourth man. I called them the four Jacks, like in a deck of cards. Now, the first and main killer and main actor was a man called Louis Diemschutz. Now, Louis Diemschutz was a man who claimed to have found the body, the first of the two, what they call double event victims, in front of his own house, which was a clubhouse for an anarchist club masquerading as an international working men's educational club. Louis Diemschutz, which, by the way, Diemschutz is a fake name. It's a Russian and German word that means protector of noble women or protector of smoke, like smoke and mirrors or up in smoke. And Diemschutz was the president or steward of this men's club. He claimed to have found one of the bodies. The second of the team, the unholy trinity I call him, was a guy called Isaac Kozbrodsky. He was only 18 and 19 years old, 17 through 19 years old during the crimes. And he was by far the most twisted and the one that did the most horrific mutilations to the women. I believe he followed Diemschutz like a lapdog. And he was a member of the International Men's Club and claimed to have been with Diemschutz when he found the body. He was also arrested with Diemschutz in a violent riot less than 6 months after the double event where they found the body. So was my third suspect, whose name was Samuel Friedman. He was a cap maker and tailor who was also a member of the men's club. I think of Diemschutz as the Jack of Hearts, and I think that he was the heart of the operation, and he also was the one who stabbed Martha Tabram in the heart. I think of Kozbrodsky, Isaac, as being the Jack of Spades. The spade in cards isn't a spade like we dig in the garden with. It's a knife. And I think of Samuel Friedman as being the Jack of Clubs. He was a club member, and also he used a club in that violent act they were all arrested for together, where he beat a policeman with a club and some other bystanders. So I call him the Jack of Clubs. The fourth man, who I believe was the funding, the mastermind, the planner, the organizer, was a man who was a Russian prince in exile from Russia, and his name was Prince Peter Kropotkin. Kropotkin was a famous thinker of the 1880s. He is one of the founders of the anarchist movement, and I believe from writings that I've dug up of his and connections I can prove of his with the International Working Men's Educational Club, I believe he's the one that assigned Diemschutz to the project and pulled him out of the project when things got too hot.
Wow.
So, well, it was that kind of went into my next question. Did the Ripper act alone? So yeah, that would be a no.
No, and let me tell you some evidence that points to the fact that the Ripper didn't act alone. Now, we know that now again, some people don't believe Tabram was a victim. I absolutely do. Martha Tabram was killed with two knives, a 9-inch knife and a 6-inch knife. On the night of the double event, Elizabeth Stride was killed with only a 9-inch knife, whereas Catherine Eddowes was killed in Mitre Square with only a 6-inch knife. Now, during the double event, an eyewitness came upon the murder scene and saw a man attacking Elizabeth Stride. And when he went to assist, another man who was standing across the street, standing guard, saw him and was yelled to by the murderer. He was yelled a code word, which was a Jewish man's name. And that man that was standing guard then chased the witness, who was also Jewish, and identified the two as Jewish. He chased the guy, down the road to a place called the Pinchin Street Railway Arch, which, by the way, another body was found at some months later. So we know that the Ripper was at least two people. Now, we know that no serial killer that I can find in history has used 2 knives on one victim. So Martha Tabram, in my opinion, was killed by 2 people with 2 knives. Now, earlier than Martha Tabram, there was a woman called Emma Smith who was attacked in Brick Lane. And Emma Smith lived for 4 days after her attack before she finally succumbed to her injuries. Now, she said she was attacked by 3 guys. She said one was about 25 to 30 years old. She said one was about 45 years old, and he just stood guard. And she said one was about 17, and he did the most brutal act to her. He's the one that stuck something inside her and cut her up, which caused her death. And also, he raped her, according to her testimony. Now, at the time when Emma Smith was attacked, Isaac Kozabrowski was 17, Louis Diemschutz was 26, and Samuel Friedman was 42. So they fit perfectly within that description that Emma gave. And I believe she was their first real serious victim. I believe she's the first one that died. There were 2 attacks before her where the women didn't die. And again, the descriptions match my killers in one way or another. So regardless of whether you believe Emma Smith was a victim, some don't, some are convinced as I am. And if you don't believe that Tabram was a victim, then you at least have to know that when Elizabeth Stride was killed at the International Working Men's Educational Club, we know that an eyewitness saw at least 2 people involved, one killing her and one standing guard. So I know that there's at least 2 killers, and probably 3, in my opinion, definitely 3. I still don't understand why so many ripperologists refuse to acknowledge that fact and still stubbornly cling to the theory that it's one person acting alone. The evidence just does not point at that in any way, shape, or form.
Right.
Well, were there any other eyewitnesses or any other clues to the other murders that happened?
Yes, there were. And there were witnesses who described the Ripper as being 25 to 30, and some said he was 40, which fits with Friedman and Diemschutz. But one of my best eyewitnesses says, yeah, the Ripper was covered in costume jewelry. He had a huge gold chain that went across his vest. It had a big red jewel dangling from it, and he had a horseshoe tie pin. Now, even in this modern day and age, it is not really common for guys to wear costume jewelry. Less so in 1880s, and even less in the worst part of London. If you're walking around in the worst part of London in 1800, first of all, a jewel that size doesn't exist, so it had to be costume jewelry. But even a giant gold chain like that, you'd be killed. You couldn't walk around London with a real gold chain. You'd be killed. So the horseshoe tie pin, the gold chain, the big red jewel, that points to somebody who has some involvement with costume jewelry. That fits my guy to a T. He was a costume jewelry salesman. The Ripper was described by a lot of different witnesses as wearing a wide variety of hats, something called a wide awake hat, which is something that the Jewish men were known for wearing back then and still do today. A billycock hat, a deerstalker cap, like Sherlock Holmes is known for wearing, a peaked cap. There was a wide variety of hats. Now remember, one of my suspects was a cap maker. Another was a cap machinist. Diemschutz's wife was a cap maker. So who would have access to such a wide variety of hats, but maybe people involved in the hat industry? And by the way, 4 of my victims were known to have purchased hats within a very short period before their deaths. So I believe there's a connection there. One of them, we know for a fact where she bought that hat, and that hat was purchased 0.2 miles away from Samuel Friedman's house. So we have this connection to hats. Samuel Friedman was also a tailor, and the Ripper was seen by a number of eyewitnesses, and they said he was wearing a wide variety of coats. They describe a cutaway coat. They describe a long, what they call an astrakhan coat, which is something that the Jewish men wore back then and still wear today. It has a kind of a lapel with a different velveteen kind of material around the lapel. So the Ripper was described as wearing all these hats, all these coats, and costume jewelry, again fitting, and the age, again fitting perfectly with my guys. He was described as being Jewish by all the witnesses, which all of my guys were Jewish. And believe me, it's nothing anti-Semitic. I'm not going after Jews per se. It's just that so much of the evidence points to the Ripper having been a Jewish man. And had he been, anything, Italian, Chinese, whatever, that's where the evidence takes you. That's where you go.
Okay. Well, could you tell us what the McNaughton Memorandum is?
The you're referring to McNaughton, one of the police officials?
Yes.
Well, McNaughton, he was one of the upper echelon in the case, and I believe, and he, by the way, had his own sort of suspect, and he had his good reasons. Some people believe strongly in his suspect. I don't want to sort of what's the word, discredit any of the other Ripperologists, because Ripperologists a lot of times have a tendency to violently sort of almost hate on each other, and I don't like doing that, and I don't like to belittle anybody. But when you talk about Sir Melville McNaughton, he was well, let me give you an exact description of him so that I don't do him any sort of injustice. I want to make sure on my facts on him before I tell you anything that's incorrect, because he's not really a factor in my investigation. So let's get back to him.
Okay.
All right, because I don't want to quote on his memorandum until I check my facts. So let me just look into him. So in the meantime, while I'm working on my notes, I'm going into my notes now so I can tell you what I've gathered on him. Let's talk about some of the suspects that you had asked me about earlier, and we can talk about McNaughton's suspects as well.
Okay.
So one of the main suspects that was considered back in the day was a guy called Aaron Kosminski. Now, Kosminski was a very seriously insane man, and when you look at him, initially you want to think the Ripper was probably a very seriously insane person. And you want to think that, it makes sense for it to be a stark raving lunatic. But the problem with that is, first of all, when I explained to you about the Theotokos connection and the fact that those dates were carefully chosen, a stark raving lunatic wouldn't be able to choose such days, or wouldn't be able to sort of have the brain power, the intellect to be able to pull off some of the stuff that the Ripper pulled off. In other words, a lunatic would not be able to fool the police in the way that the Ripper did. He wouldn't be able to write letters that appeared to be from an illiterate, but were actually very obviously from someone of high intellect. And this guy was someone that they used to find sort of wandering the streets, stark raving mad naked sometimes, and spent some time in lunatic asylums. So he wasn't really, in my opinion, a viable suspect. You have a guy called Montague Druitt, who was a school teacher that had been dismissed from his position at a boys' school for some indiscretion that no one really knows for sure what it was. And under suspicion of being the Ripper, he actually committed suicide by jumping into the Thames with his pockets weighted. And the murders continued after he died, in my opinion. So, this is the guy that McNaughton believed was the killer. And I think, and that's where your memorandum comes in, that Montague Druitt was a guy who, if anything, and this hasn't been proven, and I don't want to slander the guy, and a lot of people believe that he was doing something unsavory with the boys at the school. So
right.
If that were true, and he were a pedophile, and he was involved in some sort of scandalous behavior with these boys, as McNaughton believed, past history has proven to us that homosexual men don't kill women. They kill men. Let's look at Jeffrey Dahmer or John Wayne Gacy or a number of others that aren't as well known except to the people that really delve into the subject. So McNaughton was convinced that it was Druitt. And, I don't want to discount the man. He was there. He interviewed witnesses that I can't possibly interview. But I believe he was wrong in that Druitt, first of all, as I said, committed suicide. And there ended up being more murders afterwards, I believe. And then again, it depends on who you believe is the actual killer. If you believe that there were only these 5 canonical murders, then you could possibly agree with McNaughton and say it was Montague Druitt. I just don't personally agree with him. Now, another suspect that people bring up is a guy called Francis Tumblety, who was a Irish-born American quack doctor who used to wear like this weird army-looking uniform and a strange helmet and fur collar and just an oddball kind of Dr. Hook medicine show type of doctor. And people suspect him as well, but it looks like from the evidence that he also was homosexual. And if he was, which the evidence seems to point to, again, homosexual men don't generally kill women. They don't serial kill women. And so it doesn't make sense, besides the fact that Druitt also left under suspicion and went to New York before some of the other killings took place. So to me, he's exonerated by the fact that he wasn't in the country for some of the murders, if nothing else. So some of the other suspects, there's a guy that was called George Chapman, who had also a Jewish name, Kozlowski. And Chapman was a guy who had murdered a couple of his wives, poisoned them. And he was a suspect because he was a murderer. But again, looking at past history, we know that poisoners of their wives aren't serial killers. When you look at serial killers, they don't touch their closest relatives. If you look at, say, the BTK killer, or you look at Ted Bundy, or you look at John Wayne Gacy, a lot of these people were supposedly happily married, Gary Ridgway, and their wives supposedly had no idea that they were out doing these horrible murders. And you don't hear about a Ted Bundy or a John Wayne Gacy or any of these guys, a Gary Ridgway, killing their own wife, let alone 2 of them. And you don't also hear of a serial killer who poisons his relatives and then knifes strangers. So it doesn't fit. The idea of George Chapman being the Ripper doesn't fit either.
All right.
So
those
did
are some
any
of the main suspects. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, does any of the evidence, of the killer show anything about maybe they're being left-handed or right-handed, and would it make a difference in the murder case? or cases?
Well, according to my experts, it is very difficult to determine the left or right-handedness of a murderer based upon some different factors, because it depends the position of the murderer, which way he held the knife, kind of dagger-like or opposite. Now, having said that, I will say that some of the doctors that examined the bodies back then had made the conclusion that the Ripper was left-handed in at least some of the cases. So but not all. They didn't all agree that the Ripper would have been left-handed. There are some that say he was left-handed, and there are some that say it's not possible to determine. My doctors say it's very difficult to determine, but the evidence showing two different possibilities of handedness show me that it's very, very possible that one of my Rippers was left-handed, and if I had to venture a guess, I would venture the guess that it was Isaac Kozbrodsky that was left-handed. Because the murder that I know that Kozbrodsky committed, the one that I'm absolutely sure he did alone, is one of the murders where the doctors were fairly certain it was a left-handed killer.
Well, were the authorities able to authenticate any of the Ripper's letters?
No one has ever been able to authenticate any of them as coming from the Ripper. There are constant debates going on to this day as to which, if any, of those letters are authentic. You have, one school of thought that most of them are authentic. Some people believe that only one. Some people believe more than one. Myself, I believe there are 4 that are authentic. Now, there have been also a number of newsmen that claim to have written the letters to incite more readership, to try to get people involved in the case, and they say that they wrote the letters. But again, no one can prove, in fact, that they wrote the letters. They just say they did. If we look at history, as history has taken place since then with serial killings, you do have a lot of cases where people falsely confess and claim to be the killer for whatever reasons. They want some notoriety. So it's possible that someone might have written those letters in order to stir up more readership, in order to stir up more interest in the case. But my own belief is that some of those letters have to be real, in particular the From Hell letter. It is, even though you'll find people that will disagree with me, it came in with a piece of the victim's kidney in a box. So there are those that'll say, well, that wasn't the victim's kidney. It was some kidney from maybe a medical specimen, and it was a joke. I personally believe it was real. I don't think somebody got a piece of kidney and sent it to the police, to play a joke on the police or for publicity. I believe that was absolutely from the Ripper, and it was sent to a particular person that the Ripper hated for his own reasons. It wasn't sent to the police. It wasn't sent to the news agency. It was sent to a guy called George Lusk, who ran this, what he called the Vigilance Committee of Whitechapel, which was basically a bunch of vigilantes running around beating up innocent Jews, calling them the Ripper. And I think that the actual Rippers knew about this guy and absolutely hated him and chose him to terrorize him with that piece of kidney and that From Hell letter. So if no other letter is real, it has to be the From Hell letter that we have to all agree must be real. But you'll find Ripperologists that'll disagree with me on that one.
All right. So did you tell everyone who George Yard is?
Well, George Yard is not a person. George Yard is a place. Now, it's a good thing you brought that up because, as I mentioned before, Louis Diemschutz claimed to have kept his horse and buggy stabled in a place called George Yard, which was where Martha Tabram was killed. Now, there are people that say, well, wait a minute. He qualified that statement by saying he kept his horse and buggy in George Yard, Cable Street. Now, there was another George Yard in Cable Street, which was a little bit south of his house. And some people say, no, he didn't keep his horse and buggy in George Yard where Martha Tabram was killed. He kept it in George Yard, Cable Street. Now, I believe that he did keep it in Martha Tabram's George Yard, but then realized his mistake once he said it and qualified it by changing and saying George Yard, Cable Street. I can't find any record of any policeman ever following up and making sure that's the actual George Yard he kept his horse in. But in any case, if he did keep his horse and buggy in the other George Yard, it was a stone's throw from another murder scene at Pinchin Street. Remember the Pinchin Street Railway Arch where the eyewitness was chased by the accomplice, where another body was found later. So, whose name was Hart, by the way, Lydia Hart. Now, I know that if he kept his horse and buggy in that George Yard, Cable Street, either way, he's a stone's throw from a murder scene. I think, though, it's my opinion that he kept it in the George Yard where Tabram was killed, but after he made the statement, he went, oh crap. I think I just shot myself in the foot there. And I think he then qualified it by saying he kept it in the other George Yard stable.
Right.
So, what were the Whitechapel murders? How does this seem to connect with the Rippers murders?
Well, Whitechapel being the area of London where the murders took place, basically the Ripper murders and the Whitechapel murders, that's synonymous. It's, depending on who you talk to, they're the same thing. However, if you want to say the Whitechapel murders covers all these 14 killings that I believe were the Ripper, all of them, and some people believe weren't all the Ripper. So the Whitechapel murders would encompass all of the murders that took place during that period they called the Autumn of Terror. And regardless of whether you believe in the canonical 5 or any of these other murders that I believe the Rippers did, they would all sort of fall under that category of Whitechapel murders.
Okay.
So, why the Whitechapel murders, had attracted so much attention? Because they were, people thought that they were the Jack the Ripper killings. I mean. Well,
yeah. I mean, again, you had quite a number of murders taking place within Whitechapel, and they weren't all prostitute murders. I mean, you got to understand, Whitechapel was this really impoverished area, homeless people. There were all kinds of crimes going on in Whitechapel, not just murders. There were robberies. There was, of course, prostitution. There were burglaries, and so there were a number of murders that took place in during that period that we know couldn't have been or wouldn't have been Jack the Ripper. There were other people that were caught, shootings, stabbings, and other murders. So I suppose, some people might refer to all of those as the Whitechapel murders, but I think in general you'll find that when people talk about the Whitechapel murders, it's basically synonymous with the Ripper killings.
Right. So what was the 4 coincidences between the double event and the Socialist riot of March '89 that piqued your curiosity?
Well, what happened was, one of the ways that I was these guys came onto my radar screen was that 3 of them were arrested during this socialist riot that took place less than 6 months after the double event that they all were present during. They claimed to have been there when the body was found by Louis Diemschutz, because Brodsky, Friedman, and Diemschutz's wife were all there when he found the body, quote unquote. Now, less than 6 months later, Diemschutz led a group of protesters to the church or the synagogue in Mitre Square that was run by his arch enemy, the Rabbi Dr. Adler, who Prince Kropotkin and Diemschutz absolutely hated. And I've uncovered documents where they've written about how much they hated this guy. They led Diemschutz led the marchers to Adler's synagogue at Mitre Square, where the second of the double event murders took place. So Adler came out of the synagogue and drove them away. He wouldn't allow them to come in. So there's your first connection between the murderers, between the socialist riot and the double event. They marched to the scene of the second of the double murders. When they came back, they started rioting against a group of people that were outside the club, the IWMEC, the men's club, shouting. And one of the men that was assaulted by the group, by my suspects, was a guy called Israel Sunshine. Israel Sunshine lived at 108/119 Goulston Street, which was the address where the famous Goulston Street graffito, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing," was left on the wall over a piece of bloody apron that was ripped from Catherine Eddowes at the Mitre Square murder. So we've got a guy, an arch enemy of Louis Diemschutz, being assaulted at the club who lived at the location where the Goulston Street graffito was left. That's coincidence number 2. Coincidence number 3 being that the 4 people who were involved in this fracas that they got arrested for later on were Diemschutz, his wife, Kozbrodsky, and Friedman. His wife wasn't arrested, but she assaulted a policeman. Now, the 4th coincidence is that when the police did come, Diemschutz, Kozbrodsky, and Friedman dragged that policeman to the exact spot inside the club's gateway where Diemschutz claimed to have found the body of Elizabeth Stride. And they beat that policeman to a bloody pulp, and Diemschutz gave him a savage kick in the leg, and they beat him with sticks and punches and kicks. So there are 4 connections to the double event right there in that riotous behavior. Now, people say that a person who kills will always have, or a violent criminal will always have some violence in his background. And so people have said to me, well, where's the violence before the Ripper murders? You know, and I show them this violent behavior at this riot where these men were arrested. And they say, well, where's the evidence before the murders? And I say, well, by your logic then, where's the violence before the riot? And that would be the Ripper murders. I still do believe, though, that they all have some violence in their background that I haven't uncovered yet, but I believe I will at some point find more in their backgrounds. But if you believe that the past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior, then where's the violence that would have predicted the violence at the socialist riot of March '89? I would contend it's the Ripper murders.
Huh. Wow. Okay. Well, I know you talked earlier about the connection between the hats and the costume jewelry and all that. Is there any more, coincidences between those 2?
Oh, yeah. Well, we have the fact that 3 of my suspects, 2 of my suspects and my main suspect's wife were all involved in the hat industry. And as I was mentioning about the hats, now I have a belief about the hats that I didn't mention yet, and that is none of these women had a hat pin in their belongings. Now back then it was a very precious sort of possession, a hat, especially to an unfortunate woman who worked for 2 pennies or a loaf of stale bread. So a hat was a major purchase for them. And the women back then used to wear a hat pin to hold their hat in place. But yet none of the women that were killed had a hat pin. I believe, which by the way is a piece of costume jewelry, I believe that Diemschutz took their hat pins. Some of the victims, at least 2, were found with their hats laying right next to their heads. And you think, well, during this violent struggle, wouldn't the hat have come off right at the beginning of the attack instead of right at the end? So I believe that in some cases, the women had the hat pinned to their head, but the hat pin was taken as a sort of a trophy, a souvenir. And we know that, for example, Annie Chapman had 3 costume jewelry rings that she wore that were forcefully ripped off her hand. and left her hand bleeding. I think that Diemschutz took those as a kind of a souvenir, and he may have even sold her those rings, because remember, Annie Chapman was one of the two that we know used to buy and resell costume jewelry to earn extra money. So I think that Diemschutz knew her from that, and I believe he took her rings because she didn't have a hat on.
Huh.
Well, I know you mentioned this a little bit earlier, but maybe explain it more for everybody, because especially for me. I know you explained, your take on the facial mutilations, especially that was done to Catherine in Mitre Square.
Yeah.
Why Mitre?
Mm-hmm.
And what about the position she was left in that brings to mind the blasphemy of an important Christian prayer? Why was that so? What is the religious ramifications about all this in your theory or your evidence?
Yeah. Great question. Okay, for your viewers, or your listeners, if they look at the YouTube video I have up that I've linked to your website, they can see for themselves a picture of her face that was done by forensic artist Michael Trott. He recreated the woman's face with all the injuries as they were described and drawn by the police, but he made it look more realistic. And if you look at that drawing, or if you just look at the police drawing, it's very obvious if you turn that drawing on its side and look at it from the angle that the killer would have looked at it. All of the doctors who examined the body agreed that the killer would have been kneeling on the right side of the body. So he'd have been looking at her face sideways. And if you look at her face in that same orientation, you see very, very clearly 6 of the letter I, 3 vertical and 3 horizontal. You see I cut into her face very plainly. And you see also these V's. You see 4 what look like upside down V's. But when you take an I and you marry it with an upside down V, it looks like a K. Now, my killer's name was Isaac M. Kozabrodsky, I.K. There was an M carved on her chin. So when you look at that drawing and you know that your killer was Isaac M. Kozabrodsky, it's really, really plain to see that the initials I.K. were carved in her face 3 times. Now, if you don't subscribe to my theory, you don't believe that it was Kozabrodsky writing I.K. in her face, which to me is plain as day when you look at those drawings. You can also see V.I., V.I., V.I. carved into her face 3 times, which would be 666 in Roman numerals, Roman being the language of the church. Now, she was killed in a place called Mitre Square. And, you may or may not know what the mitre is. Most of us think of a mitre box like we cut angles, in wood shop. But the mitre is actually the name of the hat that's worn by the Pope. So at the time, Pope Leo XIII, who was Pope at that time, wore the mitre. I believe that the Ripper was trying to throw tainted blood on the head of the Christian church by killing her in Mitre Square. And I believe also that the Mitre Square was chosen because of its connection to the Reverend Adler, who was despised by Kropotkin and Diemschutz, and also the position she was left in. If you look at my website, or if you look at some of the things that I've linked to your website, you'll see the position she was left in. And it is exactly the position that you see the Mother Mary left. If you look at in some of these icons or paintings in church of the Mother Mary, she's often left in this palms out position that's called the orans position. And she's often depicted with her palms out in exactly the position that Eros was left in. And Mother Mary in these icons has this circular, this little circle containing baby Jesus on her body, which Catherine Eddowes was left with that area ripped to shreds and her uterus removed. Now, I believe that was a kind of a blasphemous reference to the section of the Hail Mary prayer, "Blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus." I think that he left her in Mitre Square in the orans position with this blasphemous ridicule of the Christian prayer with this hole left and her uterus gone. Her womb was gone. And I think that was all designed to insult the Christian church.
All right.
Well, I know we talked a little bit about the Ripper's letters. Can you explain the Moby Dick connection to the From Hell letter?
Yes, I would love to do that. Well, you know, when I first looked at this From Hell letter, which is the one that almost everyone agrees is authentic because it came with a piece of kidney, and you look at this From Hell letter, it starts out, well, first of all, it says From Hell. Now, that was the name of that Johnny Depp movie, so a lot of people know that phrase. When I first heard that phrase, or I shouldn't say that when I first heard it, but when I really looked into it, I was saying to myself, from hell. Why is that familiar? And I was thinking, from hell, where do I know that from? And of course, when I Googled From Hell, your first 1,000 entries you get on Google will be Johnny Depp movie or Ripper letter. But eventually, you're going to find out that From Hell is one of the last lines in the novel Moby Dick, which was written in 1860, 28 years before the murders. And you go, and that line is, from hell's heart, I stab at thee. So I'm thinking, wow, that's kind of weird. And of course, in the letter, he pretends to be really illiterate, but I think he was a man that was very educated and had read Moby Dick. Now, Moby Dick is about a Jewish Captain Ahab, who was named, and a socialist, by the way, just like Louis Diemschutz was, who was named for a great Jewish king, Ahab. And by the way, the real King Ahab was brought down by Jezebel. And I believe that Diemschutz thought of himself as kind of a Captain Ahab, a leader of men. And I think that he thought of England as the great white whale that had made him less than a man. In the novel, he loses his leg to the whale. But I think that Diemschutz thought of himself maybe as being brought down less than a man by the great white whale that was England, or Queen Victoria. I think that he thought of the IWMEC, the men's club that he was the steward of. I believe he thought of that as his Pequod, his ship that he recruited men to help him kill the great white whale. Now, in the From Hell letter, he also mentions cannibalism. He mentions having eaten the other kidney, or the rest of the kidney. And cannibalism was a very, very foreign concept in Victorian England. But guess what? In Moby Dick, the ship's cook was Queequeg, who was what? A cannibal. So I think there was a connection to cannibalism in Moby Dick. Well, I know there was, and I believe that was what prompted the cannibalism in the From Hell letter. Now, in Moby Dick, Ahab's number one right-hand man, the teller of the tale, is 17-year-old Ishmael. In real life, Diemschutz's right-hand man was 18-year-old Isaac Kozbrodsky. So I see all these connections to the Moby Dick letter, or to the From Hell letter, to the novel Moby Dick. I believe that he was a very educated man and had read that novel, because after all, it was about a socialist Jew who was forced into a very dangerous profession, whaling, for slave wages. And I think that novel would have appealed to a socialist. Sorry, my dogs are barking at something out there. But I do believe there's a connection there.
Well, how did propaganda play into the crimes? I noticed you refer to martyrdom as, quite a bit in your essays. How did that, play such a part?
Well, first of all, propaganda, is a term. It is a tactic that's very near and dear to socialists, anarchists, communists. And, you guys are probably too young to remember when propaganda was basically synonymous with kind of Russian information that was disseminated to discredit the United States. But propaganda is something that, again, is very near and dear to communist, anarchist, socialists, which my killers were. I think that, for example, the only reason we know about the IWMEC, the men's club, is because of the Ripper killings. So it served as a form of propaganda. Now, anarchist communists, they don't hate prostitutes per se, but they hate prostitution. I think that they used those prostitutes as martyrs. And in fact, in the IWMEC newspaper, they referred to the victims as martyrs, not victims. They said, oh, martyr number 1 was killed here, martyr number 2 was killed here. They called the victims martyrs rather than victims. And I think that they chose the prostitutes not because they hated prostitutes exactly, but they hated prostitution. And I think that they looked at them as sort of martyrs to the cause. If somebody's got to die here, it's going to be them. And in the long run, our actions are going to help the prostitutes, are going to rid London of this scourge of prostitution. So they, I believe, thought of the victims not with hatred so much as martyrs to a cause. And if you look at the writings of Prince Kropotkin, he uses the word martyr constantly, and he refers to people killed in his cause as martyrs. And in fact, the night of the double event, when the police came into the IWMEC, the members of the club, particularly Diemschutz, delighted in showing the police grisly photos of what they called martyrs, people that had been killed in their cause in some recent riots that had taken place in Chicago just before the Ripper killings. So I think that they looked at their victims as martyrs to an overall cause of ridding England of the what they called sweating system, which was practically a slavery of Jewish people, where the Jewish people were forced into this difficult sweatshop type labor for slave wages. They were depicted in very insulting ways in the newspapers. They were pretty much forced to live in Whitechapel. They were prejudiced against very strongly, and I think that was the underlying motive in the killings. So they used the prostitutes as martyrs to a greater cause.
Well, I understand you've anagrammed the Goldston Street graffiti. What is your interpretation of it? And what do you believe was the killer's actual intention in leaving the bloody apron segment and the cryptic message on the wall? And why there exactly?
Okay, well, I think, first of all, why there? I think that they chose that particular place because Diemschutz hated a person that lived there, Israel Sunshine, that he beat in that socialist riot. I think that maybe he thought, well, I can point the cops at Israel Sunshine's house. Maybe it'll bring him some grief if some evidence to the crime is found at his place. And I think that's why they chose that particular place. And I also think the name Goulston played into it because I think Diemschutz liked a word game. And I think he was playing on ghoul as being part of Goulston, because a ghoul, we think of it as a goblin or a ghost nowadays, but the actual term ghoul refers to grave robbers, people that take body parts, which is something that the Ripper did, took body parts. So I think that Goulston was kind of a joke that he wanted to play. I also think that it was chosen because it appeared to make the killer look as though he was running away from the club. I think that after doing the second murder in the double event, on their way back to the club, if by stopping at Goulston Street, it made it look like the killer had diverted and gone in another direction to the club, but not very far off the track, so that the police would think, oh, he went that way. In actual fact, just a little ways off the track, leave the evidence, and then run back to the club. So that's why I believe they chose Goulston Street and that particular location. Now, they wrote this cryptic message that no one can agree exactly what it said because the police washed it off the wall before it could be photographed. But the message was something along the lines of, the Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing, or the Jews are not the men that will be blamed for nothing. And it was misspelled in some ways. Now, I took those letters and I anagrammed them over 1,000 different ways and couldn't come up with anything telling. I came up with a lot of really grisly messages. Lots of really horrific things can be found in that message. But once I finally realized that it was Louis Diemschutz, Isaac Kozbrodsky, and Samuel Friedman, I was able to anagram letters of the message. And I have to say, I had to add a letter that wasn't in it, and I had to change a G to a C in the word nothing, which I believe could have been the way it was written. In London, and especially in the East End, when you say nothing, they pronounce it as nothing with a K on the end. So I think that when they wrote it with a C on the end rather than a G. So by adding one A and changing the G to a C, which no one can say for sure whether or not that's what it said, I can anagram that message to read, "That bent whore be the filth, not the Jew men, L.D., Isaac, nor Samuel." So that, there'll be a lot of people that will argue with me because I had to add an A and I had to change a G to a C to come up with that. But I believe that it's very possible that it was written just that way and no one would notice. And I've done the experiment on friends of mine. I've shown them the messages I believe it to have been written and said, take a look at this. And I let them look at it. And then I told them, okay, write down what you think that said. And of course, none of them got it right. So I believe that it's very possible that it was written just that way. And it was anagrammed out to read, "That bent whore be the filth, not the Jew men, L.D., Isaac, nor Samuel." Bent is English slang for twisted or perverted. And, it's not something we use so much in the United States, but they use it in England, and especially back then. Bent was a way to describe someone sexually twisted.
Huh.
Now,
So,
the apron, you asked me about the, oh, sorry, go ahead.
That's what I was going to ask you about. So what about the apron segment?
Okay. Now, I believe that because of a postcard that was sent by the Ripper to the police before the double event, they intended to cut off a victim's ear and leave it in place instead of the apron with the graffito at Goulston Street. I believe that they intended to leave the ear that they chopped off of Catherine Eddowes, but the killer dropped the ear and couldn't find it in the dark. It was found in the folds of her clothing at the autopsy. So I think that he cut off her ear, but couldn't find it once he dropped it. And when he saw a policeman's lantern coming, he was forced to grab anything he could that would connect the graffito that he was going to leave to the victim. So I think he cut her apron in half. I mean, why would you take the time to cut the apron in half? Why wouldn't you take the whole apron? Why would you leave half of it and take half of it? I believe he took the time to cut it in half because he needed the police to definitely marry it or identify it as matching the half that was left with the victim, thus connecting the graffito that they had planned to leave all along with the Ripper killing and point at Israel Sunshine's house. So I think that they ended up taking the apron instead of the ear that they had promised the police they were going to take. It was, in fact, cut off, like I said, but they lost it, because Brodsky dropped it into her clothing and couldn't find it. And when PC Police Constable Watkin came along and interrupted him, he had to do something. So he cut that apron and took it with him and left it where I believe the intention was to leave the woman's ear under the graffito, thus completely identifying it with the Ripper killing. But because they lost the ear, they were forced instead to use the apron. And they made sure to take a piece that had blood on it and had some feces on it. So there was absolutely no doubt that it was from the murder scene. And that way they could draw attention to this graffito, which I think was a way of taunting the police, leaving this cryptic message which referred to Jews and referred to the Jews not being the men to be blamed for nothing, a kind of double negative, which was also the style of writing that they used in their club newspaper that I found and translated. In any case, I think that even if you don't believe the anagram and you want to take it as what the police think they remember it as having said, even if you want to take the message at face value, the Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing. If you look at it that way, you could say, well, the Jews, the men were Jews, but they weren't going to be blamed for nothing. They were going to be blamed for everything. So it even makes a sort of bizarre sense in that double talk or double negative way if you don't want to believe in the anagram. And I understand why people would say it's a stretch for me to add a letter and change one letter in order to arrive at my conclusion. But I do believe it's the truth, and I've actually done experiments with people, and that's the way they remembered it as well, rather than what it actually said.
So what exactly kind of evidence have you developed against Kropotkin?
Well, and I'm glad you asked me that, because some people have expressed some doubt and have expressed some indignation that I would blame this great thinker of anarchy. Now, the reason I believe that he was the mastermind and the funding is because, first of all, I can show many connections between him and the IWMEC. He was an IWMEC member in other countries. He is well documented as having spoken at the men's club a number of times. He was very definitely connected with the club. But what I found after having found those connections between him and the club was in his writings, I found a couple of references to Jack the Ripper, in which he basically praises Jack the Ripper. And he basically says, well, if we would have been there when the Ripper killed that poor woman who asked him to pay for her lodgings, it probably would have occurred to us to put a bullet through his brain. But in retrospect, it would have been much better to put a bullet into the brain of the owner of the wretched den that poor woman was forced to live in. There's a couple of problems with that statement. Number one, how does he know that girl asked the Ripper to pay for her lodgings? Because nobody knows what that girl said to the Ripper except the Ripper. So how does he know what that girl asked? Secondly, when he says the bullet would have been better placed in the brain of the owner of the wretched den, a few days after the Mary Kelly murder, the owner of the wretched den she lived in got a letter from the Ripper, which I've detailed in my YouTube video, which contains a lot of secret messages, not that secret, but kind of hidden messages. And so he's over here saying, the real criminal is the owner of the wretched den that woman lived in, not the Ripper. And he goes on to sort of praise the Ripper in some ways and say, he's not really the criminal. And if we really look hard at the situation, we would, and if he ever does get caught, it's really the judge that would sentence him to death that's the murderer that we should hate, not the Ripper. In fact, all of our hatred for the Ripper would disappear if we really took a good hard look at why he did what he did. So the people that get mad and indignant that I would accuse Kropotkin, I think haven't read that. And I think that Kropotkin himself expresses admiration for the Ripper in a couple of different ways in another statement as well that he made. So I don't know if he'd be that insulted. And besides that, don't forget, Kropotkin was imprisoned twice for subversive actions against the government, and he did promote terrorism. And he was also kicked out of Switzerland, which is not an easy thing to do. He was kicked out of Switzerland under suspicion of being behind the assassination of the Tsar of Russia. So he already has suspicion hanging over him of being involved in conspiracy to kill someone. So it's not really that far of a leap in my logic for him to be involved in conspiracy to kill some prostitutes in order to end the sweating system against his people in London.
Right. All right. So what happened during the 3-month period that your lead suspect, Diemschutz, was incarcerated for an unrelated crime?
Well, remember that he was put in jail, maybe I didn't tell you, but he actually was put in jail. He was the only one of the group that attacked the policemen and the bystanders that was actually jailed. Because Brodsky wasn't jailed. He paid some sort of fine. Friedman didn't show up for trial, and apparently they didn't pursue him. And Diemschutz's wife wasn't charged for assaulting the policeman. The Diemschutz did go to jail. And during that 3-month period, there were no Ripper killings. But 18 days after his release, there was a Ripper killing. A woman named Rose Milet was killed, right after 18 days after he was released from jail. Now, interestingly, though, there was one prostitute killed while Diemschutz was in jail. And her name was Elizabeth Jackson. But she wasn't killed in the same MO. She was drowned and then dismembered, and parts of her body were strewn all over London. And so people say, well, she wasn't a Ripper victim. The MO was different. So a lot of people will tell you that wasn't a Ripper victim. And I might say that too, except for the fact that she was killed very likely on a Theotokos night. And if anything, if she was a Ripper victim, it was the other two, Friedman and Kozbrodsky, that killed her while Diemschutz was in jail. Remember, he already had one really good alibi that he was with the police during one murder of the double event. And I don't know if I talked about that yet tonight, but he was with the police while the second double event murder took place that his friends committed, while he had the best alibi in the world, sitting with the police after finding the first body. But his second best alibi in the world is I was in jail when the murder took place. So they probably thought, wow, they've got one of us in jail for an unrelated crime, but what if they start suspecting him? Because they're going to know he's one of the guys that found a body. So maybe we should do a killing while he's in jail. That'll absolutely prove he's not the Ripper. And so their killing would probably be a different MO, because different killers without Diemschutz masterminding. And the body parts strewn all over London, maybe to really draw attention to it. You know, the body parts are found here, there, and everywhere. And Diemschutz is in jail, so absolutely it can't be the Ripper, in case anybody was starting to suspect him. So it could have been, you know, that killing of Elizabeth Jackson might have been a Ripper killing, but might not have. But certainly no classic Ripper murders took place while he was in jail. But like I said, 18 days later, there was one. But I should go back now and explain to you his alibi for the double event. He claims to have found a body. He said it was 1 o'clock exactly, which we know it wasn't because the police were on scene by 1:05. And we know from events from the eyewitnesses that it was more like 12:45 when he found the body, although he insisted it was 1. But the second murder of the double event took place at 1:42 a.m. while he was sitting with police at the men's club. But what I believe happened was that his two accomplices pretended to run for the police when they all found the body, quote unquote, and they went and they were under orders to wait at least a half an hour before finding another prostitute and killing her, thus sealing Diemschutz's alibi, because he's with the police when this second murder takes place. So because the Ripper had warned the police with a postcard that there would be a double event that night, he knew that the police would assume that the killer did the second murder in Mitre Square. So if Diemschutz was with the police when the second murder took place, he couldn't possibly have done the second murder. Thus, if he didn't do the second murder, he didn't do the first one because that was the same guy. So he sealed his alibi, and that's why so many people have let him off the hook for 129 years, because he couldn't possibly have done that second murder. He was with the cops, and he knew it. He knew that if he pretended to find a body at 1, he knew that by 1:30 every policeman in London would be at his club. And thus he'd have this airtight alibi for the second murder taking place 0.6 miles from his house at Mitre Square. Then the two guys that did that murder, one of them went home, dropping the knife along the way, right around the corner from his house, and the other one came running back to the club pretending to have been looking for a policeman and couldn't find one. So now he's got two super airtight alibis for 2 Ripper murders. One, I was with the police, and the other one, I was in jail.
Huh.
Damn. Well, can you explain the connection between the Ripper and Sherlock Holmes?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked me that one too. Because, you know, my new book is presenting my theory in the form of a Sherlock Holmes novel. But the reason I got that idea, besides the fact that me and my co-authors, we're all big Sherlock Holmes fans since we were kids, but one thing I noticed with the Goulston Street graffito. The Goulston Street murder took place just months after the first Sherlock Holmes novel was all the rage in London and had appeared in this Beaton's Christmas Annual magazine. And this first story of Sherlock Holmes that appeared just months before the Ripper killing, where a graffito was left on the wall, was called A Study in Scarlet. In The Study in Scarlet, the murderer leaves a message written in blood on the wall over two different murdered bodies. And it's a coded message. It's something that is first misinterpreted by the police as a woman's name, but it's actually the German word for revenge. So I believe that the Ripper modeled the Goulston Street graffito after this. It's called Rache. The word is Rache, the message that meant revenge that was featured in The Study in Scarlet. I think the Ripper said, that's a good idea. I'm going to do that. I'm going to leave a coded message on the wall, to throw the police off. But I think he was inspired by Sherlock Holmes. Remember, he was the steward of a men's educational club. So I believe he was a reader of Sherlock Holmes. And I think there's a connection there between the Rache graffiti in Study in Scarlet and just a few months later, the Ripper killing, in which a graffito was left on the wall. I mean, that word, even the word graffito from the Sherlock Holmes novel, became a household word after the double event, Goulston Street graffito. We hear graffiti, writing on the wall, but graffito is the singular in Italian for graffiti. And I think that the Ripper was motivated by that particular aspect of the story. And I think, the way that art mimics reality and reality mimics art, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote a story some time later called The Adventure of the Cardboard Box. And in The Adventure of the Cardboard Box, Doyle has some human body parts preserved in salt, mailed in a small cardboard box to a woman who becomes Holmes's client. And of course, I believe that the Ripper, we know that the Ripper sent a kidney in a small cardboard box to George Lusk with the From Hell letter. So I think that Doyle got the idea for the cardboard box from that aspect of the Ripper case. So the Ripper paid sort of a tip of the hat to Doyle with his graffito, and I think Doyle tipped his hat to the Ripper case, not to the Ripper, not that he admired him in any way, but I think that inspired the cardboard box story.
Okay. Well, could you tell us more about your co-authors and who they are in the forensic and criminology? Yeah. My co-authors are very, very, very respected forensic pathologists and criminologists that, are just known throughout the world. Firstly, Dr. Michael M. Baden. You may know him from that HBO show Autopsy, or you may have seen him on Fox News, where he is a consultant. He's frequently called in, to talk about cases in the news. He took part in the Warren Commission analysis of Kennedy's autopsy. He was involved in the O.J. Simpson case, Tsar Nicholas of Russia's autopsy, or not his autopsy, but the investigation into his death. Sid Vicious. He was involved in that Klaus von Bülow case, Sonny von Bülow. They made a movie out of it. I can't remember the name of it right now, but it was a famous case. Maybe it was Dangerous Liaisons. The Phil Spector case, the record producer that was tried for shooting a woman in his house. Medgar Evers case. The Michael Brown case in Ferguson recently that caused all the riots. He was called in on David Carradine's autopsy, and he's just been involved in so many high-profile cases through the years, written tons of books, very respected, and he's one of my co-authors. Dr. Cyril Wecht, he's very well known, again, a guy that appears constantly on Forensic Files and all these different, NBC and CBS programs and things like that. He was involved in the analysis of President Kennedy's assassination, Robert Kennedy's assassination. He was involved in Elvis Presley's autopsy, also in the O.J. Simpson case,
and the JonBenet Ramsey case. He's testified in, the Mary Jo Kopechne, the one that was drowned, Senator Ted Kennedy's case. Also involved in the Sonny von Bulow case. Dr. Jeffrey McDonald, the Green Beret that was convicted for killing his family. The Waco Branch Davidian fire. Vince Foster's death. He's written a bunch of books, Cause of Death, Grave Secrets, Who Killed JonBenet Ramsey. And then there's Dr. Henry C. Lee, who's a martial arts expert, by the way. He was involved in analysis of the Kennedy assassination, JonBenet, OJ. He was pivotal in the recovery of Elizabeth Smart, the girl that was kidnapped in Utah. It was Dr. Lee's work that actually uncovered who kidnapped her and her actual rescue. He used to have a TV show called Trace Evidence on Court TV, before it became True TV. He was part of the Connecticut State Police from way back over 30 years ago. He was the first criminalist in Connecticut, and he is the driving force basically behind the creation and growth of the Connecticut State Police Major Crime Squad. He has a forensic science laboratory at the University of New Haven in Connecticut, and he's recognized as, one of the top, if not the top, criminologists in the world. And I'm very fortunate to have those three men as my co-authors on my book, Sherlock Holmes and the Autumn of Terror.
Wow. Wow, you do have some high-profile people. Woo.
You see,
well,
so
here's the question.
When people go on.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
Well, when people, the knee-jerk reaction when a new Ripper theory comes out, and a new one comes out just about every year, the knee-jerk reaction is to automatically discount it and say, well, this guy's a crackpot. But for me to have those three men backing me, it should, I hope, speak to the believability, the feasibility of my theory. Because these men were all approached by other authors, one particular very famous, very recognizable author, to sort of rubber stamp their theory of the crimes, and all three refused to take part in that project because they didn't believe in that theory. But yet all three of those doctors have not only agreed to participate in my investigation, but their names are on my book. They're actually co-authors. They helped me analyze the murders, recreate them, and then we turned it into a fictional story with Sherlock Holmes doing everything that we did in terms of the investigation. And in my book, Sherlock Holmes guides the reader through the crimes and the detection, the investigation behind unraveling the mystery in a way that's supposed to be, and hopefully is, entertaining and somewhat educational, I hope.
Well, here's a question I like to give all my guests, seeing how that, I deal a lot with the paranormal. Have you ever had any paranormal experiences or any crypto encounters or UFO encounters that you could talk about? Well,
I think I saw a ghost when I was a kid. It's kind of a funny story. Well, I don't know if it's funny, but there was a one time as a really young kid, I think I was probably maybe 12 or 13 at the time, myself and another friend spent the night at another friend's house. It was a really old house, real creepy old house. And the three of us were talking about ghosts pretty much most of the night, and kind of worked ourselves into a state where we were saying, wow, we'd love to see one if one would ever appear. And would you be scared? No, I don't think I'd be scared. And we all kind of laughed about it. And the guy who lived in the house went to bed. And the two of us stayed awake and continued talking about ghosts. And then we saw what both of us believed to be a ghost. Who knows what we really saw. But I remember it very, very clearly as being what looked like an old man carrying a little dish with a candle on it in a nightgown with a little cap on. And he walked across the kitchen and into the refrigerator and disappeared. And we were just freaked out about it. And we immediately thought it was some kind of joke played by our friend, which maybe you could do now with holograms or something. But back then, it would have been nearly impossible to pull such a joke. But we went into my friend's room, and he was in there snoring. We woke him up, and he thought we were crazy, and we still thought it was some sort of a joke. And eventually we fell asleep, and the next morning, none of us talked about it, never spoke about it, and none of us even thought about it until a couple of years later when those same two guys came to visit me at my house in Chinatown. And they came for this Chinese New Year celebration where I was doing a martial arts demo, and the one guy was going to help me, and he brought this other guy with him. And this guy's name was Mark. So when I saw Mark, and, you know, we started reminiscing and everything, but none of us remembered that incident at all. Only when the third guy, his name was Rod, went into the house and left Mark and I alone out in the yard, did we remember that incident. And then I said, hey, Mark, do you remember that time we saw that ghost at Rod's house? And he's like, yeah, I do. And it was really strange because then we remembered the old man, in the nightgown, and we both exchanged, what we remembered, and it was exactly as we experienced it. And we remembered it at that time. And then I went and did my demonstration, and they went home. Well, exactly a year later, I didn't see Mark or Rod again for a whole year, but exactly a year later, they came back to my house when I was doing another demonstration in Chinatown for martial arts demonstration for Chinese New Year. And the two of them came to my house. And Mark's sister had just been killed in a parachuting accident. And it was his first time to come out of the house in maybe a month. And Rod thought it would be a good idea to bring him out to Chinatown to get him out of the house. And again, when Mark and I were alone together, I remembered the incident and hadn't thought of it again during that entire year. Hadn't thought of it at all. And I said to Mark, hey, remember that incident? And Mark didn't remember it at all. And in fact, he got mad at me and said that I was in some way making fun of him and somehow related it to his sister's death. And he was mad and left my house kind of in a huff and didn't remember it at all. And since that day, I've been able to remember it at any given time. But that kid, Mark, well, he's not a kid anymore, never did remember it again after that incident. So, I don't know what to make of that. It's just a strange experience I had in life that I'll never forget.
Wow, that is strange. So how supportive is your family with all your work?
Well, very, very much so. My mother is a very big supporter of my work. And in fact, my mom is the one that kind of turned me on to true crime. My mom's always been a fan of the true crime novels. Before there were forensic files and everything, it was just the books. And she used to give me her books when she was done reading them and got me interested in true crime. And so my mom was very pivotal in my investigation because as I was working, I would bounce ideas off her and she would give me ideas to follow up on, and she helped me quite a lot. And in fact, I've dedicated my book to my mother, my father, my big sister, and my martial arts instructor, who was Bruce Lee's top student.
Wow.
Whoa.
Now, since you guys are interested in the kind of creepy or the paranormal, I shouldn't say the creepy, but I'll tell you a kind of a creepy experience I had in the writing of this book, which is pretty strange. When I first discovered this connection to this blasphemy of the prayer, Hail Mary, it upset me a lot because I thought to myself, they've really destroyed in my mind this prayer that, someday I'm going to have to, I'm going to have to hear this prayer at my own mother's funeral someday, which I hope is many years in the future. But I thought, I was really mad about this prayer being sort of soiled. And when I was speaking to my mom the day I discovered it, she could tell that I was upset about something, and I didn't really want to tell her what it was because she's very devout and very religious. And she eventually said, no, listen, you can tell me anything. And I said, no, Ma, I don't want to wreck this prayer for you. And, she said, no, I want to know. So when I explained to her about this prayer and how they had blasphemed, blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus, she said to me, well, guess what? It doesn't upset me at all. In fact, it makes me happy because, you know, the fruit of my womb is going to bring justice against these guys. You're the fruit of my womb. And you're going to bring these guys down and sort of name them and shame them for what they did in an attack on Christianity. So it didn't wreck the prayer for her at all. And in fact, since then, I feel much better about it myself and no longer get upset when I think about that prayer.
Wow. Well, since we got about 10 minutes left, I'm going to go ahead and ask you, you know, what are your plans for, 2017? You know, do you have any other projects you're working on or anything you could discuss with us?
Well, sure. Number one, I'm planning to write another true crime factual account of the investigation against the Rippers without Sherlock Holmes, just the facts and just straight out detailing of the investigation. But one of the things that I'd really love to do, I hope it's in 2017, I want to reopen the investigation into the death of Bruce Lee. Because, as I mentioned, my teacher was his top student, and I've been a longtime fan of Bruce Lee as a martial artist, and I strongly believe that he was murdered. And so my next big investigation, if I can get the funding and I can get the backing that I need, would be to investigate more thoroughly the death of Bruce Lee and what I consider to be the murder of Bruce Lee.
That'd be cool. That'd be very interesting.
Because I've always looked up to Bruce Lee. Great man. Wow. Died too young. And his son, too.
Both
Brandon.
Bruce was only 32.
Yeah, I know. It's just that's so sad. Well, if anyone's interested in finding out more about the Ripper, your books, the martial arts, or if they have any, concerns, questions, thoughts, or comments, how's the best way for them to get in contact with you?
Well, probably the best way is to go to my Facebook page. It's Sherlock Holmes and the Autumn of Terror. You could Google that. You could look on Amazon where the book is sold, which leads you to an author page that links you to the other books I've written about the martial arts, as well as, Sherlock Holmes and the Autumn of Terror. The Facebook page, I believe, is called Randy Williams versus Jack the Ripper, VS. Randy Williams VS Jack the Ripper, no spaces. And then they can find the essay that I call What If, in which I pose a lot of questions about the Ripper. What if I could show you this? What if I could show you that? And then it links you to the essays where I do, in fact, prove the what ifs. So I say, what if I could show you that, the Ripper was shown to was known to have worn a number of hats, and then I show you through a linked essay the connections between my suspects and hat making. Or I talk about Mother Mary and the Four Jacks, and I lead you to an essay where I show you the Theotokos connection to the murders. Or there's an essay that leads you to, or there's a link that leads you to the essay that what led me to them, and so on, or the double event and how it was accomplished and why, what was Jack's motive. And the what if essay poses the questions and then links you to the essays in which I go into detail on my proof of those facts. And I show evidence that hasn't been seen before that I uncovered in the IWMEC records and other sources. So I think that's a good start. And what I would sort of implore the listeners to do is have an open mind and ignore your initial instinct to disbelieve that Diemschutz could possibly be the killer, because he's been overlooked for the reasons I explained earlier. He set himself up with this ironclad alibi. But when you look at the evidence that I've uncovered regarding more than one murderer, more than one weapon, the connection to socialism, the connection, the graffito, the double event and how it was done, the Mitre Square and IWMEC connections to the riot, all these different things, they're all detailed in this essay. So I would just beg the reader to be open-minded enough to look at the evidence and make up your own mind. And there's statements that Diemschutz and Kozbrodsky made to the newspapers with information they couldn't possibly have known when they knew it unless they were involved. And it's right there in the record for anyone to see. It's not my conjecture. It's in the record. All you have to do is look at the record and see it and make the connections I made. So I would hope that, your listeners would take a look at the What If document, take a look at my YouTube video where I took one of the Ripper letters and showed where Diemschutz hid his name, Isaac Kozbrodsky's name, and Samuel Friedman's name, as well as Prince Peter Kropotkin's name in this little sketch, and shows the wounds to Catherine Eddowes' face, shows the IK carved into her face, shows the VI carved into her face. Take a look at those things before you discount my theory as crackpot. And remember who my co-authors are and understand that they gave me the time of day to listen to my theory and help me in my book. So, that's really the best way to find me is that Facebook page, Randy Williams versus Jack the Ripper, Sherlock Holmes and the Autumn of Terror, or, just go to that Amazon or the hardbound version is sold on Lulu.com. And, take a look at what I've come up with. It's 40 plus years of investigation, 5 years that I've known who the killers were and put into this novel form. And if you're a Sherlock Holmes fan, you might like it just for that reason, because it's written in, real faithfully in the style of Conan Doyle.
Wow.
I hope everybody goes up there and gets your books, because, everything that you presented tonight, excuse me, it's fascinating. It gives a different aspect and eye-opening to the whole case. And, sir, I have nothing but respect for you, and I appreciate you coming on the show on such a short notice. But I open, the door is always open. You have an open invitation anytime, and to come back and talk about anything you want to talk about. Because it's just fascinating.
I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed it a lot. And I just want to say, to those ripperologists that don't agree or they have their own thoughts about who the killer was, I want to make sure that everybody knows, I'm not ridiculing anyone else's theory. I'm not here to cast aspersions on any of their theories. I didn't want to disrespect, for example, the original investigators like Melville McNaughton. I didn't want to in any way sound like I discount their opinions. I value their opinions. I took them into consideration, but the evidence just didn't lead me to any of their suspects. It didn't lead me to Kosminski. It didn't lead me to Kozlowski. And particularly didn't lead me to Montague Druitt. I think McNaughton was very sincere, and he had his reasons for believing that it was Druitt, but I just don't see the evidence supporting it. But I in no way want to say that I think any of those investigators were substandard or anything like that. They didn't have the luxury that I have of going back and looking at case histories of murders that have taken place in the 129 years since the Ripper murders.
Well said. Well, like I said, Randy, I appreciate you coming on the show, and the door's always open, my friend.
Yes, thank you so much.
You guys having me. It's been really fun, and I hope that your listeners weren't too terribly bored. I hope they enjoyed it, and I'm open to all kinds of questions. And find me on my website. It's easy to get in touch with me the way that I explained, and I'm happy to entertain questions from people that are open-minded. They don't have to agree with me, as long as we can RIP, ripperologize in peace.
Well, you have a good night, Randy.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, that's it for us tonight. I want to thank Randy Williams for coming on the show, and to thank everyone who took the time to listen in. I'd like to give a big shout out to the Vibe Radio Network, also to the first responders and our men and women in the armed services. Thank you all for your service. Our guest for next Thursday night, January 26th, will be Stefan Barcelo. Stefan is a photojournalist, a videographer, and owner of Cryptozoology and Paranormal Museum in Littleton, North Carolina. So turn in next week to another exciting show starting at 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Until then, be safe and everybody have a good night.
Night, y'all.
And now, insurance-minded speeches from Geico.
It's a common expression, don't look a gift horse in the mouth. However, what if the horse's mouth is filled with useful insurance tools? This is the exact case with the Geico app. Yes, the app is free and therefore a gift horse. However, look inside the app and behold, emergency roadside assistance, digital ID cards, bill pay. Get the Geico app. Look it in the mouth, get amazing services. Thank you.
There is more to me, Queen Eliara of Elfgard, than my elven magic. Just as there's more to Geico than saving you money, Geico also gives you 24/7 access to licensed agents online, on the phone, or on the Geico app. And while I am a mighty elf queen, I am also a mighty big fan of barbecue potato chips. Minions! More smoky mesquite.
Geico. Expect great savings and a whole lot more.